Hi guys and welcome, Gnemon here. Today's topic is permanent and remote chunk loading. So what is chunk loading? It's a technique that typically uses various redstone components to artificially load chunks that are not in reach of any player, that host farms and contraptions which we want to keep operational without us needing to being there. Currently, chunk loading means we need to create giant chains of hoppers going to these remote locations and also deal with the problem that from time to time, which is every 45 seconds, game will find all the chunks that are not loaded by any player and forcefully unload them, which may cause these contraptions to break or lose their effectiveness in case of, for example, hostile mob switches. In this video, we will learn a bit more about chunk loading and unloading procedures, which would allow us to do a few crazy things. Load chunks we want in a permanent fashion so they will be protected even in these rare moments when the game unloads all the other chunks. And load them without connecting them to spawn, which also means we can have these things loaded also in the nether and the end, not only in the overworld. So we will pretty much achieve what chunk loaders do in modded Minecraft, but without using any mods and in survival friendly fashion. All of this is compatible with single player and multiplayer, and in case you play on servers, do I have to add that all of this will work even with no player present on the server at all? Hyped enough? I hope so, because it'll get nerdy pretty quick. And I hope you will stay with me through that, because a few things need a little bit of explaining. So let's start on some insights how chunk loading and unloading works in Minecraft. One way to load chunks is with players. When a player moves from one chunk to the other, this causes a few new chunks to load by getting inside of player's range, but also unloads a bunch of chunks they have left behind. Since these chunks know exactly when they are vacated, unloading happens immediately. But chunks can get loaded from other reasons like fire spread, redstone signals or hopper pipes. And it will not be unloaded immediately, and what's more interesting, the game has even no clue where is the best moment to unload them. So it just doesn't unload them at all. To fix it, every 900 ticks or 45 seconds it goes through all the loaded chunks and marks all of them that are not loaded by any player for removal and removes them. So that's why when we load some areas from spawn, using hoppers for example, it will be unloaded for one tick. However, the next tick, since the first hopper is loaded from spawn, it will instantly load the entire chain. Let me demonstrate it on this simplified example. Let's start with the edge of the loaded area, like spawn, where we have a hopper that points into the edge of the chunk. The game also keeps the list of all currently loaded tile entities, like hoppers, furnaces, etc., somewhere to be able to go through them every single tick and ask them to do their tasks. That's why it's a good idea to keep this list as short as strictly necessary. So if this hopper has an item in it and it's not on cooldown, it will attempt to place an item in the connected inventory like a chest. Since the block it points to is not loaded, the game will load the entire chunk for this hopper just to check that one block. But not only the blocks are loaded, but also all the entities from that chunk will be added to all respective entity lists. Then our hopper, after realizing there is nothing to send the items to, says I'm done, and then the initiative is passed to the next tile entity in line, which is our new hopper. Since it also has an item, it will also attempt to place it in the connected inventory, and since that inventory is in an unloaded chunk again, this will load the third chunk with our third hopper. The situation repeats until no new tile entities are to be processed, and that finishes that tick. This mechanism means we can load arbitrarily large area in a single tick, but it still doesn't prevent us from unloading that happens every 45 seconds. To solve this issue, we need to understand how chunk unloading works. So first, it works the same regardless if it was triggered by a moving player, which happens in the tick a player left that chunk, or by periodic chunk cleaning, which is every 45 seconds. When a bunch of chunks are requested to be unloaded, the game puts them in a structure called a hash map for all you nerds out there. And the game will be unloading them in the order they will be coming out of this hash map, which is not necessarily the same order they came in. Why the order is important? Because in order not to lag the game, it will only allow itself to unload up to 100 chunks in each tick, and the rest will be left in that queue to be unloaded later. 100 chunks at a time, so these leftover chunks are not forgotten, but they will be removed in the next tick. A chunk marked for unloading is still loaded and acting perfectly fine, it just has a delayed death sentence on its head. At this point, it is important to mention that a chunk unloading operations are at the end of each tick cycle, after all the entities have been processed. So for these first 100 chunks there is no hope, but the other ones can still be salvaged. And it is in the next tick by the same hoppers that chunk load them in the first place. So if we have a hopper that has an item in it, and when it's ticked next time requests a block from that chunk that was previously marked for unloading, it will remove that chunk from that unload list, because it seems that this chunk is still pretty useful for something. At this point, this chunk will be left in memory and will be forgotten until the next unloading cycle. So if we manage to select a chunk that's far in that list of all the chunks to be unloaded, we have a chance of keeping it alive 24/7. For that we need to know the order of the chunks as they come out of this hash map. The reason chunks come out in different order as they came in is not to randomize them but to store them effectively in that structure. And internally chunks are stored in buckets indexed by so-called a hash key. And the hash key for each chunk is computed based on chunk X and Z coordinates in cooperation between Mojang and Oracle, owners of Java. In Minecraft, chunks X and Z coordinates are concatenated into one long number required by Java called long. Then in Java this long number is cut again in half and combined using an XOR operation into an integer number called integer. This number is then passed to a hash map which cuts it in half and applies the same operation making it an even shorter number called short. And the last step is true providing we have less than 12,000 items placed inside a hash map. But who would want to chunkload more than 12,000 chunks at a time? Only crazy people. The chunk is then placed in corresponding bucket inside the hash map structure, and what's interesting, when items are leaving the hash map, they come out in the bucket's order. So to know in which order chunks are being removed, we need to know which one of them will end up in buckets 0 or 1 and which one are further down the list. And thankfully, we have the technology to compute it. So let's check a few examples. Chunk 0 and 0, represented binarily as a bunch of zeros, will get concatenated into even longer bunch of zeros and sent to Java, where it will be split in half, representing again but a bunch of zeros, and then split again, in turn represented as a 0 at the end. So the unload order of chunk 0, 0 is 0. Let's check chunk 5 and 5, for example, represented binarily as 101 and a bunch of zeros. It's sent to Java as this, and chopped in half again, where it applies the XOR operation for the first time. XOR or exclusive OR will leave 1 in each position where the bits are different and 0 when they are the same. So all our 1s become zeros again, and we get again the unload order of 0. How special! So all the chunks on the diagonal of the world have the same unload order of 0, and they will be unloaded first. Let's take chunks 7 and 5 for example. Since they only differ in 1 bit position, the results would now be 10 in binary, which is 2 for normal people, which will go through the next XOR giving 2 at the end. So the unloading order of chunks 7 and 5 is 2. What about the negatives? Let's say chunk -5 and -5, represented mostly as a bunch of 1s in binary. When they get XORed, they also give 0. So all the chunks on the negative part of the world diagonal also have 0 priority. One last example, I promise. What about the other diagonal, -6 and 5, represented as follows? When XORed, give a bunch of 1s, and when XORed again, give zeros at the end. In fact, it just so happens that all of 4 world quadrants yield the same chunk unload order, and this is just rotated by 90 degrees each. So this is a heat map of the chunk unload order for 8 chunks out from 0, 0. Color coded, so the chunks with order 0 are white and chunks that come last in unloading sequence are black. And what's cool about it is that no matter how much we move back to view more chunks, we can see the same structure repeating with greater details. So that's a great example of a fractal. So now it's 16, 32, 64, 256, and 1024 chunks. And what's useful about it is the information that we can compute chunk unload order, at least to find chunks that unload before others, and the fact that chunks of low priority are all concentrated around the diagonals of the world. And this is true with pretty much any Minecraft version running on Java 8. But in case you are still on Java 7, all the chunks on the main diagonal will always get priority 0, which might not be the case on the other diagonals. Within each bucket, you can't really rely 100% which chunks will be unloaded first, but it doesn't matter as this gives us enough power to control it, as long as we know which set of chunks will be unloaded at the first 100. Okay, enough rambling, let's go back to Minecraft. I'm here in the world 0, 0, where I located the world spawn for now, and in this demonstration I will show you how you can remotely load in a permanent fashion a few random chunks in the nether. So this device here is just to throw an item to the portal once in a while that will keep both nether and overworld loaded regardless if there is a player in any of these worlds or not. Otherwise, if you would log out, all the hoppers will be not processed at some point, which in turn would cause the entire contraption to unload. In the nether, I mapped out up to 13 chunks out in each diagonal direction and chunk load them in the following fashion. We start in the middle, and at each corner we go out in both directions, then on one of them we go back to the diagonal like so. After these 13 chunks, I hop around to the next diagonal and go back to 0 again. Then I continue to make another loop and then go back again to 0, 0. We also have a few extra chunks loaded in the middle around the portal to keep these chunks entity processing, but that's only for the items that come from the overworld, so we can burn them in fire. The important chunks are these marked with dark green, as they have priority of 0. Lime green have priority of 1 and a few others, orange for 3, magenta for 7, and black are further on with priority 15. Green and lime are the most important, as while chunks of priority 0 are only on the diagonals, priority 1s are only next to diagonals, so they are almost as useful as our zeros. And if we sum them up, we should have 52 chunks chunk-loaded with priority 0 and 48 of 1, so 100 in total. And they, once I go away, will be unloaded in the first tick. Other chunks from this loop, along with chunks far away from here that will be unloading purposely, will be waiting for the second chance. But the entire loop should update themselves next time hoppers in those orange, magenta and black chunks are ticked in the next tick, which would mark them as useful again and drop them from the unload chunk list. Oh, and in order not to worry too much about calculating unload order for each chunk, I added a simple command, unload order, which tells me what is the order of a particular chunk with that coordinates in question. So now let's move away and see if our Perma-Loader network works. So since we are running carpet mode on the server, I can type /unload and we will be getting our first 100 chunks of priority 0 and 1, followed by chunks that are higher up the list. And even if I spam save all a few times, our Perma-Loader should stay loaded. So now let's move out and load the chunks that will be actually doing some work. So we have here some of the simplest way to chunk load with the Perma-Loader running a small number of chunks. The unload priority around this place is around 30 or above, so our chunks should be safe from unloading, and since we'll put 2 hoppers pointing into each other chunks, if we leave the area going in this direction, this will unload by player means these chunks with some time in between, allowing the chunks to stay in artificially loaded state. If you would leave in this direction, for example, then it would be possible for both of these chunks to be scheduled for unloading by player means in the same tick, which would get rid of them. Remember that the Perma-Loader is not scheduled for unloading every tick, but just once every 900 ticks, so these chunks can be unloaded by us leaving the area if we don't do it carefully. Simplest way to load a 2x2 of chunks that works regardless how we leave the area should be in this loopy fashion. However, these chunk loaders are not active at this moment because they don't have any items in them. But also we can load a single chunk by placing a hopper pointing to the same chunk in it, with 4 hoppers pointing into that chunk from the outside. With this, if we leave the area, it will be unloaded by player means, but there will be always at least one chunk among these other 4 loaded that will artificially load the chunk in the middle. From now on, it will be ticked every game tick by this hopper in the middle requesting a block from that chunk every tick. And since it is also a higher unload priority, it will be kept loaded as well. So to demonstrate how this works, let's build a simple flying machine here between these 2 chunks, since flying machines are prone to breaking when chunks unload. Just to show if it works. This needs to be rotated. And there you go, simple ping pong game between these 2 chunks. And if I move out quite a bit, we can see that the ping pong still goes up in the chat, and we can check the unload order, and our 3 chunks that we unloaded on the way are still loaded. So if we're on a server, we can now even log out, and when we log in after a significant time, the ping pong match will go on. Perma-Chunk-Loader is still loaded because of the items thrown through the portal, and if you check the logs, it goes on even with nobody on the server, which is pretty cool. Obviously, in single player, we would need to stay in the Nether or the overworld for this to continue. Now we can actually simplify our permanent chunk loader setup even more, and this would lead us to the simplest perma-loader you can build. In this case, I got rid of a bunch of hoppers from each loop, essentially breaking these loops. So the question is how these chunks would be able to load themselves once the first 100 chunks, mostly green ones, gets unloaded as the first unloaded batch. And that's why we need these black chunks over here. These are here of unload priority of 15, so further down the line. And that's where the loading chain will begin, and this will be loading all the other chunks. We also need one more hopper to loop back from that green chunk to the black one. What will happen is that when the chunk cleaning tick comes, first it will unload all these green, lime, and a few orange chunks at this point, leaving these black chunks loaded. This black chunk will next tick load all the green chunks in the chain, however it will remain on the unload list and will be salvaged only by this hopper from this freshly loaded green chunk that it just made to load. which will keep this permaload structure loaded. So in turn, instead of a big loop of hoppers, we have a small loop of the pair of chunks loading themselves, one with low priority and the other one with a high one, with a bunch of zeros and ones attached to them. And this chunk loader works the same way as the previous one. To demonstrate how this can be used in practice in more survival-friendly settings, I created this world of Seed 1 to get some random realistic example and used it all as it came out. This time around, the goal will be to permanently load 3 strongholds and build 3 simple sand duplicators in each one of them, and run all 3 of them at the same time, even with no player on the server. So before we start anything, let's hop in the nether where I laid out the plan. So we can see the spawn is not at 0,0, but as typically pretty close to it. I marked with blue the spawn area, and in grey the 12 chunks view distance of the player that leaves the spawn using the portal in the middle, since I'm using server view distance of 12 chunks here for demonstration. So the perma-chunk loader needs to be outside of this larger box. Thankfully, if we come up here, we can see that just outside of this range, on the world diagonal, we have a chunk of priority 15, which means that this can be our main loop of the perma-chunk loader, with hoppers cycling between chunks with high and low priority. And to this we'll attach a tail of chunks, which will contain a little bit over 100 chunks of priority 0 and 1. And that's pretty much it. The structure doesn't need to be close to spawn, as long as it's anywhere on the diagonal of the world. But placing it close to spawn makes it convenient to load automatically. In our demonstration we'll be loading it manually, but one can load it and unload it simply by sending a redstone signal from spawn to the head of the perma-loader, locking and unlocking the hoppers in this loop, or simply by chunk loading the head of it with hoppers. In most cases, we don't want any players to interfere with it, especially if we rely on our chunk loading for something important that can break, so placing it further away from spawn also makes sense. It all depends on what you need. If a player accidentally loads parts of this hopper structure, it might be possible that some areas that we rely on loading would fall below the 100 chunks unload limit and will get unloaded. I also marked out here 3 world strongholds, which are at the ends of these lightways that go from 0,0. Let's look at the closest to us at the moment. We will have to chunk load a 5x5 area around them in order to make the chunk in the middle entity processing for the sand machine. It's not that important for other contraptions, but sand generators rely on sand behavior as a falling block entity, so we need this 5x5 here. And it's also a very good test for chunk loading, because if even one chunk of this 24 unloads when the sand is falling, the contraption will be broken immediately. That's why even with this area chunk loaded, you either need to know exactly when you can leave if you want to leave directly from the stronghold, leave the area gradually with the machine turned off and then turn it on from the distance, when none of these 25 chunks are player loaded, which also means they cannot be unloaded by player means. Or simply by delaying the start of the machine, so you would press the start button on a delay and leave the area before the delicate components of the machine start. The reason is simple. Even if the chunks are hopper loaded, if a player leaves the area gradually, all the chunks outside of the view distance will be scheduled for unloading that tick and not protected by Perma-Loader, which kicks in only with the unloading sequence that happens every 45 seconds, and this may break the contraption. Also, leaving directly by the nether is a risky business, because this would unload entire 600 chunks around this area, and this is quite likely that at least one of the important chunks would fall into this first 100 chunks to be unloaded, since chunks nearby have tendency of having similar unload order. So let's hop on. I really like this location, with this mountain range and a village connected to a small patch of dark oak forest. And the blacksmith here is quite rich too. But let's continue to the stronghold. As we can see, as we approach, we can start seeing messages coming from the center chunk indicating that it is loaded, but about that in a moment. First, the chunk loading. For that, I am simply running a circle of hoppers chunk loaders in a loop to be able to reload any chunk that gets unloaded when we leave this area in any shape or form. As we know, the perma-loader will load 100 chunks with priority 0 and 1, and in this area, if we select the area using the unload command, we can actually select an area and then command will list all the counts of chunks with specific priorities. So for that one we have chunks with orders of 80 to 87, so we should be good. And this is far from the diagonal, so that's why. So let's hop down and check what's at the bottom. So I borrowed here a heartbeat from the lava to get the simple and inconsistent but slow clock to move this guy up and down. So once in a while he will trip the wire up there connected to that command block, telling that this area is not only loaded, but this chunk is entity processing as well. And here we have some very basic and rudimentary sound duper based on Casper's and too known to name design, but you can use any design here you want. In case you want something faster, I would recommend checking Ilmango's over 100,000 blocks per second contraption he posted a few days ago, which is surprisingly simple design for what it can do, which with using this chunk loading technique you could generate in a relatively easy and lag effective way many hundreds of gravity blocks per second, even if you only play single player world. And in this case we will not be duping sand, because this would be so 111, instead concrete powder. So I'll meet you back at spawn and let's start the whole contraption. So as I mentioned before, Perma-Loader structures is just outside of spawn area, so we can visit it right now, but we don't have to as long as it comes in range or we send some signal there using any means. It will load itself. At the heart of it, we loop hopper chunk loaders between chunks of priority 0 and green ones and 15, the black ones, with a long tail of chunks in the distance. So if you go back to spawn, you can check that the structure is loaded and prioritizes unloading of chunks of priority 0 and 1, which is what we want, even if we force the game to unload the chunks. Since we are going to turn all the strongholds on through the nether, in order to prevent stopping processing of entities in the overworld, we start this egg machine. It is simply a bunch of chickens producing eggs, which I just drop here and push with the slime blocks to the nether. Using a slime block seems to be the only reliable way for the eggs to keep their momentum and burn in fire on the other end 100% of the time. This is just temporarily, so I can start the first stronghold without risking unloading the perma-loader if I don't do it within 10 seconds. So now let's turn on the first stronghold. As you can see, I'm waiting a little bit to make sure that no sand is moving while I'm leaving. So now we don't need the chicken overworld and nether loader, as the first stronghold already loads the overworld at the end. So we don't need the nether for these tasks, so we can disconnect it. Stronghold number 2 done. Stronghold number 3 done. So as you can see, all the strongholds are working just fine. At the end, 2 off-topic notes. I shouldn't be decorating my test walls, should I? Also, all the new 1.12 blocks seem to be perfect for making little dioramas, aren't they? So that seems to be it for today. Sorry for a little bit longer video, but I simply wanted to explain everything because the ability to permanently load almost any arbitrary area, either connected or disconnected from anything else, in any dimension, overworld, nether, and the end, with players present or logged off in multiplayer and single player as well, I think it's freaking sweet. And it is not only for sand machines, but also for simple mob switches for all 3 dimensions, quarries, flying machines, furnace arrays, villager farms, all prevented from random chunk unloading and breaking for that reason. So I hope you enjoyed what you have seen, and if so, please leave me a like, share with others, and drop me a comment in the comment area below. And see you in the next one. Bye bye! Oof, that was a long one. I hope nobody fell asleep. So is that all? Dang, I forgot the world downloaded in the description, but that's fine. They can find it. Shoot, forgot about one more important thing. You see, it hasn't broken, I told you. And the items are not here because hoppers are locked, but because I forgot to shut down the server last night and it was going like crazy for the entire night. And all the chests are full, I told you. It works.